Hi everyone, today's story takes us to a quiet street in Suzhou City, Jiangsu Province, a place where life usually moves at a slow, familiar pace. But on the late morning of November 26, 2010, that calm was shattered when an elderly woman stumbled into the local police station, her face pale, her hands trembling. She was breathless, almost unable to speak at first. Officers quickly brought her a chair and some water. Her name, she said, was Liu Mei-hua, and the words that finally came out of her mouth froze the entire room. "My daughter-in-law, she's dead." Within minutes, officers were racing to the address she gave. What they found inside the small apartment was chilling. In the living room lay Lin Yao-jing, a 31-year-old university lecturer wearing a cream-colored dress, now stained deep crimson. A 20-centimeter kitchen knife lay nearby. Beside it, an empty fuel canister. The air smelled not only of blood, but also of gasoline. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned drawers, no missing valuables. And strangely, the floors near the victim's body had been wiped clean, as if someone had tried to erase parts of the scene. Yet other clues. The open laptop in her bedroom, the half-prepared lesson plans hinted that whatever happened, it began abruptly. Investigators were left with an unsettling puzzle if this wasn't a robbery. What could have driven someone to such a violent act? And why leave behind tools that pointed so clearly to premeditation, yet take such careful steps to hide physical evidence? As we begin to untangle this case, one question will linger over every detail: who could walk into that home on an ordinary morning and decide that Lin Yao-jing would not live to see another day? The morning of November 26, 2010 began like any other for the residents of a modest apartment complex in Suzhou. At around 8:30 a.m., Liu Mei-hua, the elderly woman who would later alert police, left her home to meet a neighbor for a trip to the local market. Before leaving, she stopped by her daughter-in-law's room. Lin Yao-jing, her 31-year-old daughter-in-law, was at her desk, focused on preparing materials for an upcoming academic exam. Mei-hua reminded her to keep an eye on the house while she was gone. The door was left slightly ajar, not unusual in a building where neighbors were familiar with one another. Shortly after Mei-hua left, she noticed something curious. As she walked toward her neighbor's home, she spotted a woman riding a motorbike in the direction of her apartment. The face looked familiar, someone she believed had visited her home with Yao-jing in the past. The woman had something covered in black cloth strapped to the back of the bike. Mei-hua didn't think much of it at the time. By late morning, she returned from the market. That's when she stepped into a scene she could never have imagined. In the living room, Yao-jing lay on the floor, motionless. Her hair was spread across a large pool of blood. The cream dress she'd been wearing earlier that morning was soaked through. A kitchen knife lay on the floor near her head. Beside it, almost as if abandoned in haste, was an empty 5-liter fuel canister. Mei-hua's panic was immediate. She ran out of the apartment, rushing toward the police station just a few streets away. When officers arrived, their first impressions were disturbing. The smell of gasoline hung in the air, strong enough to sting the nose. The fuel had been poured not only near Yao-jing's body, but also onto her clothing. The forensic team quickly noted something even stranger. The knife, the canister, and a nearby cleaning rag had no fingerprints. Whoever had been there had taken deliberate steps to wipe everything clean. The home itself showed no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows were intact, valuables untouched. The victim's bedroom, however, stood out. Her laptop was still open on the desk next to a stack of teaching materials. The scene felt interrupted, as though she had left her work suddenly, perhaps after hearing something in the living room. Officers began considering two scenarios: either someone she knew had come to visit and been let in, or an opportunistic intruder had walked through the unlocked front door. In either case, the attack seemed highly personal. Neighbors were interviewed. Most had nothing unusual to report, except for one detail: Yao-jing was known to be private, spending most of her time either at the university or studying in her room. Her circle was small, made up primarily of colleagues and longtime friends. Investigators also learned that her husband, Dong Wei-jun, a fellow lecturer at the same university, was supposedly out of town on a work trip to Beijing. That morning, he was believed to still be away, scheduled to return the next day. But something about the case timeline would soon challenge that assumption. In the hours after the crime, police began their first sweep for evidence beyond the immediate scene. The fuel canister, the knife, and the rag were sent for forensic analysis. The absence of fingerprints suggested the use of gloves, but no gloves were found nearby. This alone pointed toward premeditation. The timeline was still narrow. 8:30 a.m., Mei-hua leaves for the market. Sometime between 8:30 and 9:30 a.m., Yao-jing is attacked in the living room. 9:00 to 9:30 a.m., gasoline is poured but no fire is set. Late morning, Mei-hua returns, finds the body, and contacts police. The question now was who had the motive and the opportunity to enter that home, carry out such a calculated act, and leave without being seen. The investigation was about to reveal that the most obvious suspects were not always the ones who left the clearest trail. From the moment the crime scene was sealed off, investigators began piecing together the forensic picture. The medical examiner's preliminary report confirmed what the scene already suggested. Yao-jing had sustained multiple wounds to the neck. None were individually deep enough to be fatal, but taken together, the injuries caused rapid blood loss. The estimated time of death was between 800 and 900 a.m., aligning almost exactly with the window when Mei-hua was out. The presence of gasoline was equally troubling. It had been poured directly on the victim and in several spots around the living room. Forensic technicians noted that if it had been ignited, the fire would have consumed the room within minutes, yet there was no sign that any attempt had been made to light it. This raised a strange possibility that the original plan might have been arson, but something changed mid-attack. Officers searched the home for other traces, footprints, stray fibers, even faint impressions left in dust. They found nothing definitive. Floors near the body were unnaturally clean, almost slick, suggesting they had been wiped with water just before police arrived. In the bathroom, an old floor rag was still damp. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife from the apartment, offered no help. It had been used before for ordinary cooking and now bore no fingerprints or identifiable smudges. The same was true for the fuel canister. Whoever had brought it into the home had taken care to erase every trace. From there, detectives turned to Yao-jing's personal life. Interviews with colleagues painted her as disciplined, private, and deeply committed to her teaching. She didn't socialize much outside work, rarely entertained guests, and had no known conflicts, except for one rumor. A colleague named Ma Shufen, who taught at the same university, was rumored to have had a falling out with Yao-jing over a personal matter. The gossip hinted at tension involving Yao-jing's husband, Dong Wei-jun. Police found that Shufen matched the vague description Mei-hua had given of the woman she saw on a motorbike that morning. When questioned, Shufen appeared startled by the news of the death. She insisted she hadn't been to Yao-jing's home that day. Instead, she claimed to have visited a friend, Han Yan, who lived on the same street but farther away. Shufen's alibi seemed thin until Han Yan herself confirmed it. The two had gone to a shopping center together that morning. CCTV from the mall backed up their timeline. Reluctantly, detectives cleared Shufen as a suspect. Attention then shifted to Dong Wei-jun. According to initial statements, he was still in Beijing on the day of the murder. But ticket records and witness accounts revealed something else. Wei-jun had returned to Jiangsu early that morning. This contradicted everything his mother had told police. Why had he come back without telling anyone? And more importantly, why hadn't he gone home? Detectives considered the possibility that he might have confronted his wife that morning, leading to her death. With that in mind, part of the team began tracking his movements while others stayed on the crime scene, combing through every remaining detail. It was a tense point in the investigation. The evidence was still circumstantial, the suspect pool was narrowing, and the victim's last moments were shrouded in silence. But the next breakthrough wouldn't come from forensics or CCTV, it would come from a confession. And it wouldn't be from the person the police had been chasing. By late afternoon, investigators were leaning toward a confrontation with Dong Wei-jun. His unannounced early return, his absence from home, and the tension in his marriage all seemed too coincidental. The plan was simple: locate him, bring him in for questioning, and see if his account aligned with the evidence. But before they could even reach him, something unexpected happened inside the police station. Liu Mei-hua, the very person who had reported the murder, suddenly changed demeanor. Sitting in the corner of the interview room, she began to tremble. Her breathing quickened, and her gaze dropped to the floor. Then, without prompting, she raised both hands and said softly, almost matter-of-factly, "You should arrest me. I'm the one who did it." The room went still. Detectives glanced at each other, unsure if they had just heard a genuine confession or the desperate words of a mother trying to shield her son. But as Mei-hua began to speak, the details flowed too easily to be fabricated.
She described years of friction between herself and her daughter-in-law. From the early days of the marriage, she admitted she had disliked Yao-jing, viewing her as too independent, too unwilling to bend to the household's traditional expectations. Mei-hua had lived with the couple on and off, and those periods had been marked by constant arguments over household routines, cooking, and even sleeping arrangements. In her mind, Yao-jing had taken her son away from her. The resentment festered. Small disagreements turned into daily tension. Attempts at reconciliation failed, and over time Mei-hua began to see her daughter-in-law not as family, but as an obstacle to her own place in the household.
According to her confession, the idea of killing Yao-jing had taken root weeks earlier. On November 11th, she had a canister of gasoline brought to the apartment and hid it away. She claimed her initial plan was to scare Yao-jing by threatening to burn the apartment, but her story shifted as she spoke. It became clear that she had been preparing for a much more final outcome. On the morning of the 26th, with her son out of town and the young child staying with grandparents, Mei-hua saw her opportunity. She deliberately turned the television volume up to an irritating level, knowing it would pull Yao-jing out of her room. When Yao-jing came to ask her to turn it down, Mei-hua refused. The argument escalated quickly.
When Yao-jing unplugged the television and began preparing to leave for lunch with friends, Mei-hua went to the kitchen, put on gloves, and retrieved the gasoline. She poured it over her daughter-in-law, who stumbled and fell. Mei-hua then grabbed a kitchen knife and struck her repeatedly in the neck. She admitted that she had intended to set the fire afterward, but decided against it, fearing it would draw attention too quickly. Instead, she cleaned parts of the scene, hid the gloves, and went to the market with a neighbor, acting as though nothing had happened.
When asked why she was confessing now, Mei-hua's answer was chilling in its simplicity. She had overheard detectives discussing suspicion toward her son, and she couldn't let him take the blame.
Her statement aligned disturbingly well with the forensic evidence.
The gloves explained the lack of fingerprints.
The absence of forced entry fit with her living in the apartment.
The fuel canister's placement matched her account. As her words sank in, detectives realized the suspect they had been chasing was no longer a mystery. The killer had been the one who first brought the case to their door. Yet this revelation opened a deeper, more unsettling question, not just of guilt, but of motive. Was this purely the result of years of family conflict, or was there a deeper resentment, a belief that eliminating Yao-jing would restore the control Mei-hua felt she had lost? The truth would now move from the interrogation room to the courtroom. The trial of Liu Mei-hua began almost a year later in December 2011. In the packed courtroom, the tension was palpable. On one side sat members of Yao-jing's family, still grieving the loss of a daughter they described as intelligent, devoted, and full of promise. On the other sat Mei-hua, small in stature, her expression unreadable. The prosecution presented a case built on her own confession, the physical evidence from the apartment, and the timeline that placed her alone with the victim that morning. They argued that this was not a crime of sudden passion, but one marked by planning the acquisition of the gasoline weeks earlier, the gloves to avoid fingerprints, and the deliberate choice of a time when no one else would be home. Witnesses were called to establish the long history of conflict between the two women. Neighbors spoke of overhearing arguments, and colleagues recounted Yao-jing's private struggles, living in the same household as her mother-in-law. The forensic pathologist testified about the multiple shallow wounds consistent with repeated deliberate strikes, and the traces of gasoline found both on and around the victim.
The defense did not deny that Mei-hua caused Yao-jing's death. Instead, they argued for leniency, portraying her as an elderly woman whose judgment had been clouded by years of emotional strain and family tension. They emphasized her role as a caregiver and mother, framing her actions as the breaking point of an already fragile mental state.
When it came time for Mei-hua to speak, her statement was brief. She said she regretted what happened, but her words lacked the emotion the court might have expected. She repeated that she acted alone and that her son had no involvement.
On December 2011, the court handed down its verdict death sentence with a 2-year suspension of execution. In China's legal system, such a sentence often leaves room for commutation to life imprisonment if the convict shows good behavior during the suspension period.
2 years later, Mei-hua's fate took another turn. She was diagnosed with gallbladder cancer while in custody and was granted medical parole to receive treatment outside prison. This effectively meant that her time in incarceration was cut short, an outcome that stunned and angered many who had followed the case. As for Dong Wei-jun, he faced no legal consequences. In fact, he wrote a formal petition asking the court to consider his mother's health and reduce her sentence. His decision deeply divided public opinion. Some saw it as filial duty, others as a betrayal of his late wife's memory. With Yao-jing gone, Wei-jun inherited the apartment they had once shared. Not long after, he was seen in the company of another woman, and within months he had remarried. In the eyes of the law, the case was closed. But outside the courtroom, questions lingered about whether justice had truly been served and whether a system meant to protect victims had, in this instance, fallen short. When news of Liu Mei-hua's early release reached the public, the reaction was immediate and emotional. In online forums and social media threads, people questioned how a premeditated killing could result in just a few years served. For many, it wasn't just about the legal technicalities, it was about the message it sent. In China, stories of tension between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law are not uncommon, often rooted in generational differences, cultural expectations, and living arrangements. But this case stood out because the conflict didn't remain in the realm of arguments and cold silences. It escalated to a fatal act. The legal outcome reignited debates about leniency for elderly offenders, especially in cases involving family members. Supporters of stricter sentencing argued that age and health should not overshadow the severity of the crime. Others claimed that while the act was indefensible, it reflected a breakdown of communication and empathy within the family unit, a problem they believed needed more attention in society at large. For those who knew Lin Yao-jing, the pain was compounded by the sense that her life's work, her dedication to her students, and her personal aspirations were all cut short without true accountability. Friends remembered her as someone who believed in fairness, who treated people with respect even when faced with hostility at home. The idea that her story ended in such a way felt profoundly unjust. From a narrator's perspective, it's difficult not to dwell on the what-ifs. What if someone had stepped in earlier when the arguments were still just words? What if the family had sought outside mediation before resentment hardened into rage? Cases like this force us to confront uncomfortable truths. Sometimes the greatest dangers don't come from strangers. They come from within our own walls. There's also the unsettling question of legacy. After the trial, Dong Wei-jun moved forward with his life, remarried, and continued his career. Mei-hua lived out her remaining years away from public scrutiny. But Yao-jing's story exists now only in the memories of those who loved her and in the cold lines of a court transcript. And so we're left with a troubling reflection on justice. Is it measured solely by the number of years a person serves or by the lasting impact of their actions on those around them? In this case, the legal process concluded, but the moral reckoning may never fully end. I can't help but wonder, when family loyalty collides with truth, which side should win? And more importantly, if we saw the warning signs in our own lives, would we act in time to prevent history from repeating itself?